She was left at the altar with nothing but a note. 2 years later, the whole county stood and applauded her. This is the story of Lydia Mercer and what she built from the wreckage of the worst day of her life. If this story moves you, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far Lydia's story travels. Hit that like button and stay with me until the very end. Because the moment that silenced an entire harvest festival, you won't see it coming. The morning Lydia Mercer was supposed to become a wife, she woke up before the sun, not because she was nervous, though she was, in the tight, fluttery way that lives just below the ribs. She woke up because the light in early May came in sideways through the warped wooden shutters of the boarding house, and it fell across the foot of the bed in a long gold stripe that reminded her for just one moment of her mother's kitchen, of the way dust used to drift through the windows of their farmhouse while the smell of warming beeswax rose from the workshop out back, and everything in the world felt like it had a place and a purpose. She lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling with its water stain shaped like a running deer, listening to the town come alive outside. A cart rattling over the packed dirt of Main Street, two men arguing in low voices somewhere down the block. The distant percussion of a hammer, someone already at work, someone for whom this was just another Tuesday. For Lydia, it was supposed to be the day everything changed. She got up. She washed her face in the cold basin, dried it on the rough linen towel hanging from the nail by the window, and looked at herself in the small oval mirror above the dresser. She had her mother's jaw, strong and slightly square, the kind of jaw that looks stubborn in photographs but determined in person. Her hair was dark brown and thick, the kind that fought back against pins, and she'd spent the better part of the previous evening wrestling it into submission. It had held, mostly. A few strands had already escaped near her left temple. She didn't fuss with them. She'd learned a long time ago that some things weren't worth the fight. The dress had been borrowed from a woman named Cora Hensley, who was roughly Lydia's size and had been married 3 years ago in a ceremony everyone in Millhaven still talked about, mostly because the cake had collapsed spectacularly during the reception, and Cora's husband had laughed so hard he'd cried. They were still laughing about things together, from what Lydia could tell. That seemed like a good omen, borrowing a dress from a happy marriage. Lydia pulled it on carefully. It was ivory, not white. Ivory suited her better anyway, her mother had always said, with small pearl buttons up the back that required a flexibility of arm she didn't quite possess. She managed the bottom half. The top half she left for later. She had 2 hours. She sat on the edge of the bed and let herself do the thing she'd been avoiding. She thought about Silas. Silas Boone was 28 years old and the second son of Franklin Boone, who owned the largest dry goods operation in Millhaven and 3 surrounding counties. Silas himself didn't work in the store. He'd made that clear early on, with the casual ease of a man who'd never had to explain why he didn't work. He had a way of appearing useful without actually being useful, of standing in the middle of a room and making everyone believe the room needed him there. He was handsome in an uncomplicated way. Dark eyes, good teeth, a square jaw that photographs better than it aged. He had come courting last autumn when Lydia had just arrived in Millhaven and was still getting her footing. She'd been working at the milliner's shop on 3rd Street, doing alterations and repair work, sleeping in the small back room in exchange for extended hours. It wasn't much. It was what she had. He'd walked into the shop one October afternoon asking to have a hatband replaced, and he'd looked at her the way men sometimes looked at women who were trying not to be noticed, like her invisibility itself was something interesting. "You're new," he'd said. "That's a fact," she'd said, and hadn't looked up from her needle. He'd laughed, loudly, genuinely, the kind of laugh that made other people in the room want to know what was funny. "I like that," he'd said. "Most women in this town answer everything like they're being tested." She'd glanced up then, just briefly. Maybe they've been tested. He'd come back the following week, and the week after that. And somewhere in the slow drift of November into December, when the cold came down hard off the mountains and Lydia's back room felt like a very beautiful icebox, she'd let herself believe that Silas Boone was something she'd been wrong to doubt. He was attentive. He brought small gifts, nothing extravagant, just a bag of early season apples, once a book of pressed wildflowers he'd found at an estate sale, which was exactly the kind of thoughtful, strange gift that made her pay attention. He listened when she talked about her parents' farm, about the bees, about the particular satisfaction of pulling a full frame from a hive and seeing it heavy with capped honey. "You really love it," he'd said once, sitting across from her at the small table in the milliner's back room, both of them sharing the dregs of a pot of tea. "The bees, you talk about them like other women talk about people." "Bees are more interesting than most people," she'd said. He'd smiled at that. Not the performance smile, the real one, smaller, slightly crooked on the left side. "Marry me then," he'd said, like it was the most natural thing, like it was just the next sentence. She'd laughed. "You haven't even told me your mother's name." "Margaret," he said immediately. "She hates being called Maggie. She makes the best potato bread west of the Missouri, and she will tell you so herself if you give her the smallest opening. She thinks my brother is the smart one and I'm the handsome one, and she's probably right on both counts. She'll like you. She likes people who give her real answers." Lydia had looked at him for a long moment across that small table, in the cold back room with its single lamp throwing yellow light on the both of them. "Ask me again in spring," she'd said, "when the world isn't frozen." He had, and she'd said yes. The wedding was set for 10 in the morning at the church on Clement Street. Simple, practical. Lydia had no family left to fill pews. Her father had died of fever 3 winters back, her mother the following spring, and the farm had gone to creditors before the grass had grown back over the graves. She had a few acquaintances in Millhaven, a few women from the milliner's shop who had said they would come, Cora Hensley, who had lent the dress and promised to sit in the front row to give you something to look at that isn't Silas's family staring you down. She'd appreciated that. She was finishing her hair when she heard the knock. 3 sharp raps on the boarding house door. Impatient, she opened it expecting Cora, who had said she'd come early to help with the buttons. It was a boy, maybe 10 years old, with a nose that had clearly been broken at some point and a gap between his front teeth wide enough to whistle through. He was holding an envelope. "Miss Mercer?" he said. "Yes." He held out the envelope with the particular blankness of a child who has been told not to ask questions. "Man gave me a dime to bring this." She took it. The paper was good quality, cream-colored, with a slight texture. Her name was on the front in handwriting she recognized. The boy turned and left. He didn't run. He walked, which was somehow worse. Lydia stood in the doorway of her room in a half-buttoned borrowed dress and opened the envelope. The letter was not long. "Lydia, I am sorry for the manner of this. I have left Millhaven. My father has arranged a matter of business in Denver that requires my immediate presence and my full investment of resources, financial and otherwise. The Hartley girl has agreed to accompany me as my wife, which will consolidate the 2 families' holdings in a way that makes the whole venture considerably more sound. I think you are a fine woman. I want you to know I mean that, but I think you deserve someone whose circumstances allow for a simpler kind of future than I can offer. I hope you'll understand. S." She read it twice. The first time her brain didn't understand. It saw the words in the right order and still produced something like confusion, like a door you've walked through 100 times suddenly opening onto a different room. The second time, she understood. She stood very still for a moment. Outside, the town was getting louder. She could hear the church bell on Clement Street beginning to ring the quarter hour, which meant it was 9:45, which meant in 15 minutes she was supposed to be standing at the front of a church. She folded the letter carefully, pressed the crease with her thumbnail, slid it back into the envelope. Then she finished buttoning her own dress because there was no one to do it for her, and she walked to the church. She didn't know why she did it later. If someone had asked her in the moment, she would have said she didn't know what else to do, that her feet simply carried her there out of some muscle memory of a plan she no longer had. The truth was more complicated. Part of it was pride. Part of it was the dull, disbelieving hope that the letter was wrong somehow, a misunderstanding that she would arrive and find Silas standing at the altar looking sheepish and apologetic, and she would get to be furious at him in a private way instead of a public one. But she also knew, in the part of herself that had known hard things before, that neither of those things was true. The church on Clement Street was small, with a peaked roof and a narrow door that always stuck in wet weather. Today the weather was clear and the door stood open, propped with a stone someone had painted white. Lydia could hear people inside. Murmurs, the creak of pew wood, someone coughing. She stood on the front step for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked in. The murmuring stopped. There were perhaps 40 people. Some she recognized. The women from the shop, several faces from the boarding house and the market street, a handful of people she didn't know who were presumably Silas's people. They all turned to look at her. That was the natural thing, to look. She was the bride. She walked to the front. Reverend Paul Aldrich was a compact, white-haired man who had been performing weddings in Millhaven for 17 years, and he had learned in that time to read rooms quickly. He looked at Lydia's face as she approached the altar, and she watched him understand, without her saying anything, that something was wrong. Silas was not at the altar. "Miss Mercer," Aldrich said quietly, stepping toward her. "Is everything—" "He's not coming," she said. She said it simply, the way you say a thing that is true and you are tired of pretending isn't. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that later. She wasn't proud of much from that morning, but she was proud of that. The silence in the church lasted approximately 4 seconds before the whispering started. She could hear it. Individual words first. Silas, gone, Denver, did she know? And then the whole texture of it, that specific layered hush that 40 people make when they all start talking quietly at the same moment. She stood at the altar in Cora Hensley's ivory dress, and she stared at the painted wooden cross on the wall behind the pulpit, and she breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her mother had taught her when the hives were swarming and everything felt like it was about to go wrong at once. "You don't run from a swarm," her mother had said. "Running triggers the chase. You breathe. You stay still. You let them settle." Cora appeared at her elbow. Her face was controlled, but her eyes were not. "Lydia, let's step outside." "I'm fine," Lydia said. "I know you are. But let's go outside anyway." They stood in the thin May sunshine on the church steps, and Cora listened while Lydia read her the letter aloud, her voice still flat and steady, in that way that isn't strength so much as the brief paralysis that comes before feeling. "The Hartley girl," Cora repeated. She said it slowly, like she was turning it over in her hands. "The Hartley girl is 16 years old, and her family owns the railroad contract between Millhaven and Denver." "Yes," Lydia said. "I gathered." "So he chose—" "A railroad contract, yes." Lydia folded the letter again. She had a feeling she was going to be folding and refolding this letter for the rest of the morning without quite being able to stop. "I think that's a fair summary." Cora sat down on the church steps, which was not a particularly ladylike thing to do in a Sunday dress, and she didn't seem to care at all. "What do you need right now? Tell me honestly." Lydia looked out at Clement Street. A woman she didn't recognize was walking past with a small boy, both of them already turning to look at the cluster of wedding guests beginning to spill out through the church door. She could see the curiosity on their faces, the appetite. There was nothing personal in it. This town didn't know her well enough to dislike her. But that somehow made it worse, to be a spectacle for strangers. "I need to not be standing here in this dress," Lydia said. "That's fair." Cora stood up and brushed off her skirts briskly, like someone putting herself back together through the physical act of straightening fabric. "My house is 6 blocks. Can you walk 6 blocks?" "I can walk 6 blocks." But she didn't walk 6 blocks, because the crowd coming out of the church made the steps narrow, and Lydia ended up pressed slightly to the side, and from that angle she could see down Clement Street to where it met Mill Road, and there was a wagon parked there, a plain wooden flatbed with a gray horse that looked like it had strong opinions about standing still, and leaning against the wagon, watching the church, with the particular patience of someone who has nowhere better to be, was a man she didn't know. He wasn't staring. That was the first thing she noticed. Everyone else on the street was staring, or looking away in that theatrical way that meant they wanted to stare. But this man was just watching, with the same calm, non-hungry attention you'd give to weather moving across a hillside. He was somewhere in his early 30s, lean in the way that came from actual work rather than aesthetics, with dark hair pushed back without any particular effort and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a few days. He wore canvas trousers and a shirt that had been blue at some point in its history. He held his hat in his hands and turned it slowly, brim over brim, without looking at it. For no reason she could have explained, his stillness annoyed her. Everyone around her was rustling and murmuring and performing the drama of the abandoned wedding. And here was this stranger in his work clothes turning his hat like he had all the time in the world. She started walking, not toward Cora's house, just away from the church steps, away from the soft percussion of whispers behind her, down Clement Street toward the cleaner air of the open end of town. She was passing the gray horse when the man spoke. "Do you have anywhere to go?" She stopped. It wasn't what she expected. She'd braced herself for something. Sympathy, probably, the kind that came wrapped in pity and was really about the other person's discomfort more than yours. Or maybe a question about what had happened, dressed up as concern. But that wasn't what he asked. He asked if she had anywhere to go. She turned and looked at him directly. Up close, he had brown eyes, the ordinary medium brown that gave nothing away, and there was a small scar on his chin that had been there long enough to have faded to white. He didn't look sorry for her. He didn't look curious, not in that particular way. He just looked like he'd asked a practical question and was waiting for a practical answer. "I have a room at the boarding house," she said. "I meant—" He seemed to reconsider, started over. "That's a dress for a wedding, not for a boarding house." She looked down at herself. Cora's ivory dress, the pearl buttons she'd strained her shoulder to fasten, the small cluster of white flowers Cora had pinned at the waist that morning, which was still there, looking very cheerful and very stupid. "It is," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "My name's Rowan Calloway," he said. "I've got a piece of land about 3 miles east. Used to have an apiary. Bees are mostly gone now. The whole place has been going downhill a few years. I came into town this morning to pick up some fencing supply, and He stopped. "I'm aware this is a strange thing to say to a person you just met on a bad morning." "Say it anyway," she said, because she was too tired to make him comfortable. He met her eyes. "I could use someone who knows bees. The orchard's failing because the bees are gone, and the bees are gone because nobody's tended the hives in 3 years. I can't pay much until the trees are producing again, but there's a cottage on the property, separate from the main house. It's not—" He glanced away for the first time briefly at the horse. "It's not much, but it's not a boarding house." She stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't know if I actually know anything about bees." "No," he said again, "but you talked about them just now like you'd lived with them. Women who borrow knowledge talk around the edges. You talked from the inside." She hadn't been talking about bees. She hadn't said a single word about bees. She'd said almost nothing at all. And yet he wasn't wrong. The town had started gossiping 3 blocks behind her. She could hear the shape of it even if she couldn't make out the words. The boarding house room was small and cold and had no windows facing east, and the woman who owned it, Mrs. Prater, had a tendency to knock and then immediately opened the door without waiting. She looked at the man named Rowan Calloway. She looked at his gray horse and his weather-bleached wagon and his hat that he still hadn't put back on his head. 3 miles east," she said, "give or take. I'll need to get my things from the boarding house first." Something moved in his expression, too small and too quick to name. "I'll wait," he said. Again, she did not go back to the church. She walked the 2 blocks to the boarding house and she packed the single trunk that held everything she owned, which was not a great deal, but it was hers, all of it hers, earned and kept through 3 years of difficult living after the farm went. And she folded Cora's dress carefully and left it on the bed with a note of thanks. She changed into her working clothes, brown wool skirt, heavy cotton blouse, boots that had been resoled twice. She stood in the small cold room and she looked at it for a moment. The water-stained ceiling, the narrow bed, the oval mirror. And she did not cry. She had cried at her mother's funeral. She had cried the night they handed over the farm deed to the creditor, standing in the kitchen in the dark because she hadn't wanted her father to hear. She had cried twice in the past 3 years, privately and efficiently, and she didn't feel like spending any more on Silas Boone. She picked up her trunk. It was heavy. She managed it down the stairs by hauling it 2 steps at a time, bump by bump, and she didn't ask Mrs. Prater for help, and Mrs. Prater, to her credit, had enough sense not to offer. At the door she paused. I'll be leaving today, she told Mrs. Prater. I've paid through Friday. I won't ask for the difference back. Mrs. Prater looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard not to be curiosity. Heard there was some trouble at the church this morning. There was, Lydia agreed. Good day, Mrs. Prater. She walked back to Mill Road dragging her trunk. Rowan Calloway was exactly where she'd left him, leaning against the wagon, still turning his hat. He pushed off the wagon side when he saw her coming and walked over without being asked to take the other handle of the trunk. They lifted it into the wagon bed together, and it went in clean. Ready? He said. I don't know anything about you, she said. It came out level, a fact rather than a complaint. I don't know what kind of man you are. He considered this seriously, like it was a fair point that deserved a real answer. I don't say things I don't mean, he said finally. I'm not easy to get along with when the work's going badly, but I'm fair about it. I won't pretend the cottage is better than it is. He put his hat on, and I'm not asking anything from you except what you can do. She'd heard worse promises. She'd heard better ones that had turned out to be worth less. 3 miles east, she said again. Give or take. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. The road east out of Millhaven was flat for the first mile, and then began to rise gently toward a ridge of low hills, and the hills were covered with what would have been, in a better season, the deep green of apple orchards. From a distance, they still looked like something. Rows of trees etched against the blue sky, the geometry of intention, of someone who had once believed in this land enough to plant things that took years to bear fruit. Up close, the picture was different. The trees were alive. That was about the best thing Lydia could say for them. They were alive, but they had the specific bleakness of trees that have given up expecting anything from the growing season. Branches sparse of blossom, bark in places where it shouldn't be rough, the whole canopy thin and gray-green where it should have been dense and silver-white with spring flowers. The blossoms stopped 3 years ago, Rowan said. He said it without emotion, the way farmers talked about bad seasons, as fact rather than grief, because grief didn't help the trees. Some of them never came back at all. The ones that bloom now, they don't... He paused, choosing the word. They don't set. No pollination. You get a flower, you get nothing after it. Because the bees are gone, Lydia said. Because the bees are gone. She studied the rows of trees. How many hives were there? 12, when my father kept them. There are still 8 structures standing. The bees abandoned them, swarmed out over the course of 2 summers after he died, and nobody managed them properly. He glanced at her sideways. I didn't know enough to stop it. She nodded, that she understood. What's left in the structures? Comb. Some of it's good. Some of it's gone to hive beetle. There's an old colony, small, struggling, in the hive at the west end of the apiary. I don't know how they've survived, but they're still there. Survivor stock, Lydia said quietly. They'll be important. He didn't say anything, but she felt him listening. The wagon turned off the road onto a narrower lane, rutted and edged with last year's tall grass that hadn't been beaten back yet, and after another quarter mile the main house came into view. It was a 2-story building, wood-framed, painted white once, and now the indeterminate color of wood that has weathered through several seasons of imperfect maintenance. The porch sagged slightly on the left side. One of the upstairs shutters had lost a hinge and hung at an angle. But the structure was sound. She could see it was. The bones of it straight, and the roofline still true. The cottage is behind the house, Rowan said. I'll show you. The cottage was small. He had warned her it wasn't much, and he'd been honest. It was one room with a sleeping alcove, a wood stove that had a cracked firebox tile someone had attempted to patch with mortar, a single window facing south, and a floor that was level except for one corner where it wasn't. There was a bed frame without a mattress, a table with 3 legs, and a fourth that was a block of wood nailed on, a set of empty shelves. Lydia walked through it slowly. She checked the ceiling for water damage. There was some, minor, in the corner above the alcove. She tried the stove door. It opened without sticking. She put her hand near the window frame and felt for draft. There was a little. I can patch the firebox properly, she said, and the window needs fresh chinking. I know, he said. He was leaning in the doorway, watching her assess the place. I wasn't hiding it. I didn't think you were. She put her hand flat on the wall beside the door. The plaster was cold but solid. "I've slept in worse." She said it matter-of-factly, not for sympathy. It was simply true. Something in his expression shifted. Not pity. He didn't offer her pity, which she was already grateful for, but something more careful, like he was revising an assumption. "The apiary is about 40 yards east of here," he said. "I'll take you before we lose the light." The apiary sat in a clearing at the edge of the orchard, sheltered on two sides by a row of mature black locust trees that her father would have approved of. 8 hive bodies on wooden stands, most of them showing the slow dissolution of neglect, lids warped, entrance reducers missing, some of the supers tilting from swelled wood. The grass around them had come up untended and gone to seed, but the structures were there, 8 of them, and at the far western end she could see it, the faint trace of movement that wasn't wind, just a thread of it, 2 or 3 bees moving slow circles around the entrance of the end hive. She walked toward it carefully, without haste. Slow, like the orchard was listening. She crouched in front of the hive. The entrance was reduced almost to nothing. Good, that meant the colony was conserving. The landing board showed yellow pollen pellets, recent, carried in that same day or the day before. The smell was there, faint, wax and propolis and the particular warm-bred smell of a living hive. "They're small," she said softly, "but they're there." She felt rather than heard Rowan come to stand behind her, a careful distance back. "Can you bring them back?" he asked. She stayed crouched, watching the entrance. 3 bees returning now. One of them was carrying pollen the color of old gold. She watched it navigate the entrance, vanish inside. "I can try to give them what they need to bring themselves back," she said. "That's all beekeeping really is. You can't make them do anything. You can only make conditions where they can do what they already know how to do." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a careful answer," he said. "It's the honest one." She stood up. Her knees ached. She'd been running on no sleep and nothing but tea and adrenaline since 5 in the morning, and it was now well past noon and the day was catching up with her in small physical ways. Her shoulder hurt from fighting those buttons. Her feet hurt from the walk in dress shoes. She looked at the 8 hive bodies, the overgrown clearing, the thin line of struggling trees beyond. "I'll need beeswax and lemongrass oil," she said, "and a smoker if there isn't one already. And I'll need to inspect every hive body to see what the foundation situation is. Some of that comb will be salvageable." "I can get what you need." "I'll need to find additional colonies to introduce. We can't rebuild on one struggling hive. I'll need to make contacts, find breeders, or..." She thought, "Are there any wild colonies around here? In the tree hollows? There's one, maybe 2. There's a big old hollow cottonwood down near the creek. I've seen them come and go." "That's something." She turned and looked at the orchard stretching away from them, the thin canopy, the sparse blossoms. "The trees will bloom again," she said. "It'll take time, but they'll bloom." He was watching her with that same careful attention she'd noticed on the church steps. "How long?" he asked. She thought about lying, giving him the optimistic number that would make him feel better about the gamble of bringing her here. "A full season before you'll see real change," she said. "Maybe 2 before the orchard's what it could be. Bees don't hurry." His jaw tightened slightly. Not anger, more like a man absorbing a hard fact. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "You're not going to argue with me?" Would it change the timeline? She almost smiled. It surprised her. "No," she said. "It wouldn't." "Then arguing would be a waste of both our time." He turned back toward the house. "I'll get the mattress from the spare room in the house. You'll need it more than it does." She watched him walk back through the long grass toward the main house, his hat pushed back now, hands in his pockets, moving with the particular unhurried purpose of someone who is already thinking 3 tasks ahead. She turned back to the hive at the end of the row, the small survivor colony still doing what it knew how to do, in the wreckage of something that had once been bigger and better tended. She pressed 2 fingers lightly to the wood of the hive body. It was warm from the afternoon sun. "I know how you feel," she said quietly. Not to the bees exactly, just to the warm wood, just to the general air. She straightened up, rolled her sleeves back, looked at the overgrown clearing, the warped lids, the work that would need doing before the day was out, if she was going to sleep that night feeling like she'd used the hours for something. She'd come to Millhaven with nothing. She'd borrowed a dress, and a future that turned out not to belong to her. She'd walked away from a church with 40 people watching, and she had not crumbled, and she would not crumble now. She started at the nearest hive. She lifted the lid. The smell rose up to meet her, wax and old wood and the ghost of honey. And she leaned in close to look, and she began. That night she lay on a borrowed mattress in a cottage with a cracked stove tile and a corner that listed slightly to the left, and she stared at the ceiling in the dark, and she thought about the letter in her coat pocket. She thought about Silas Boone and his good teeth and his railroad contract and his chosen practicality. She thought about her mother's kitchen and the way the beeswax smelled in the morning. She did not cry. She thought, I have worked with less than this. She thought, 3 years of less than this. She thought about the survivor colony at the end of the row, still alive in the wreckage of a neglected apiary, still bringing in pollen, the color of old gold. Outside the window, the night was very quiet. No town sounds, no cartwheels or distant hammer blows, just wind in the apple trees and, if she held her breath and listened, the faintest possible hum, low and steady and alive, from somewhere in the direction of the hive. She lay in the dark and listened to it. After a while, she slept. The first week on Rowan Calloway's land was the hardest kind of hard. Not dramatic, not the sharp pain of the church steps, but the grinding, unglamorous difficulty of starting from nothing when you are already exhausted from having started from nothing before. Lydia woke before sunrise every morning because the light came in through the south-facing window and landed directly on her face, and she hadn't figured out a way to block it that didn't involve hanging something over the glass, which she refused to do because the light was the only warm thing in the cottage in the early morning. So she woke up, and she lay there for a few minutes doing the accounting that had become automatic over the past 3 years. What she had, what she needed, what the gap between those two things required of her. And then she got up. The stove needed coaxing every morning. The cracked firebox tile let air in at the wrong angle, and the draw was unpredictable. Some mornings it caught fast, and some mornings she spent 20 minutes on her knees in front of it, feeding kindling in small pieces the way you fed a sulky animal. She'd asked Rowan for patching mortar on the second day, and he'd brought it without comment, and on the fourth morning she fixed the tile herself, mixing the mortar too thick the first time and having to pull it back out and start again. By the time she got it right, her hands were gray with it, and she was irritable in the specific way that comes from a task that should have been simple, being difficult. The stove drew clean after that. Small victories. The apiary occupied most of her daylight hours. She'd done a full inspection of all 8 hive bodies in the first 2 days, crouching over each one with the old smoker she'd found hanging in Rowan's equipment shed, a decent model, better than she'd expected, and cataloging what she found with the kind of clinical attention that left no room for discouragement. She didn't allow herself to feel how bad it was. She just measured it. 4 of the 8 hive bodies were salvageable. The other 4 had comb that had gone to small hive beetle over the winter, the wax gray and chewed through, the frames smelling of rot rather than honey. Those she pulled apart and burned, which took most of an afternoon and produced a smoke that smelled, when the wind shifted wrong, like something sweet burning, which she found unexpectedly difficult. Her mother had burned bad comb too. It was part of the work. But smell was memory's sharpest route, and for about 40 minutes in the middle of that afternoon, Lydia was back on the farm in a way she hadn't been since she'd left it, and it cost her something to stay present. She stayed present. The survivor colony at the West End she treated with exaggerated care. She fed them. A simple syrup, not rich enough to trigger robbing behavior from other insects, but enough to take pressure off their foraging. And she left them mostly alone. Some beekeepers would have gotten in there immediately, inspecting, rearranging, imposing management. Lydia had learned from her mother that sometimes the most important thing you could do was keep your hands out of a hive and let the bees do what they knew how to do. "You're not going in?" Rowan said one evening. He'd come out after supper, or what passed for supper, since neither of them was cooking elaborate meals. Lydia had a pot of beans going on the fixed stove, and Rowan seemed to subsist largely on bread and whatever was left from the previous day's work. And he stood at the edge of the clearing with his hands in his pockets, watching her watch the hive. "Not yet," she said. "How do you know what's happening in there if you don't look?" "I listen," she said. She nodded at the entrance. "Hear that pitch? That's a content hive. Not happy, not thriving, but not stressed. If I go in there now and start pulling frames, that changes. They'll spend 3 days reorienting and using resources they can't afford to spend. He was quiet for a moment. She'd learned in 6 days that his silences weren't blanks. He was processing, not checked out. So you wait. I wait. He looked at the hive the way he looked at the orchard, like a man who understood the math of patience even when it went against everything in him. The trees are like that too, he said. You can push them, fertilize heavy, try to force a season. You get fruit that looks right and tastes like water. Or you wait, she said, or you wait. She glanced at him sideways. He was still looking at the hive, his jaw working slightly in that way it did when he was turning something over. She'd noticed that. She'd noticed more than she meant to in 6 days of proximity, which was the nature of shared land. You couldn't help learning a person's habits whether you chose to or not. He was up before her, which she hadn't expected. She'd find evidence of it each morning. The barn already open, fresh wheel tracks from the wagon on the lane, sometimes a pot of coffee left on the heat in the main house kitchen that she could smell from 20 yards away when she walked past. He didn't leave it for her. He just made too much and left the rest. The distinction mattered to her. He didn't talk much while he worked. Some people were quiet out of sullenness, and some were quiet out of concentration, and some were quiet because they were carrying something heavy, and she hadn't yet figured out which kind he was. Maybe all three, depending on the day. The town began arriving in the second week, not in groups. That would have been too organized, too honest about what it was. It came in the form of individual errands. A woman Lydia half recognized from the milliner's shop appeared at the edge of the property, claiming she'd left a parcel on the road, and had she happened to see it, which was such a transparent excuse that Lydia felt almost insulted. A man from the feed store found a reason to drive past twice in one afternoon. Mrs. Clara Witt, who ran the social calendar of Mill Haven with the focused energy of a general planning a campaign, happened to be driving past the lane turnoff at the exact moment Lydia was walking back from town with supplies, and pulled her horse to a stop with the particular surprise of someone who has been waiting in that spot for 20 minutes. "Lydia Mercer," she said. "What a coincidence." "Mrs. Witt," Lydia said. Clara Witt was in her 50s, broad-shouldered, with a face that had been handsome in youth and was now formidable in the specific way of women who had outlasted several people's underestimation of them. She looked at Lydia with sharp eyes that were doing a great deal of calculating behind the warmth. "We've been wondering how you were getting on," she said. After everything. "I'm getting on fine," Lydia said. She shifted the bag of supplies to her other arm. "Thank you for asking." "Living out at the Calloway place, people are saying." "That's right." Claire's expression moved through something complex. "Rowan Calloway is a good man," she said, and there was a careful quality to how she said it, like she was offering information she expected Lydia to receive a certain way. "A private man. He keeps to himself since his father passed." "He mentioned his father," Lydia said, which was not quite true. Rowan had mentioned him only in the context of the bees, the 12 hives, the things that had been let go. But it was enough to be technically accurate, and she wasn't in the mood for Clara Witt to know how little she and Rowan actually talked. "It's just," Clara paused, chose the next words with the deliberateness of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted to say and was deciding how directly to say it. "People will talk, you know. An unmarried woman on a bachelor's property. After what happened at the church, it might be better for your reputation if—" "Mrs. Witt," Lydia said pleasantly. "With respect, I don't have a reputation left to protect in this town." Silas Boone saw to that. "So I'm going to focus on the work and let people say what they're going to say." Clara blinked. She hadn't expected that, and the surprise on her face was, briefly, before she controlled it, genuine. Then something shifted. The calculating look faded, and what replaced it was something closer to actual regard. "Well," she said. "All right then." She gathered her reins. "You need anything in town? You come find me. Not as a gossip, as a resource." She said the word deliberately, like it meant something specific. "There's a difference." "I know there is," Lydia said. "Thank you, Mrs. Witt." She walked back up the lane with her supplies, and she didn't look back. But she could feel Clara Witt watching her go, and the weight of that gaze was different from the church steps, more thoughtful, less predatory. It was something. The trouble with Rowan came 3 weeks in, and it came the way most trouble did, sideways, through a door she wasn't watching. She'd been in the equipment shed sorting through her father's old notes. She'd brought them in the trunk, the small leather-covered notebook where her father had recorded hive observations over 20 years of keeping bees, his handwriting small and cramped and dense with information. When she heard the wagon come in fast, too fast for the lane, which was still soft from the previous day's rain, and she heard the horse labor at the corner, and then the slap of the reins and Rowan's voice saying something short and sharp. She came out to find him standing by the wagon with mud on his boots and a look on his face that she hadn't seen in 3 weeks. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the face of a man who had been told something he already knew and didn't want confirmed. "The bank," he said when he saw her, not explaining, just placing it. She waited. He pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands. That habit again, brim over brim, the thing he did when he was working something out. "Henderson at the bank says I've got until the end of August to show production." He looked at the orchard. Or he calls the note. The end of August was 4 months away. She did the math without wanting to. The survivor colony was stronger now. She'd gone in 2 weeks ago and found 3 frames of solid brood, a laying queen she'd spotted moving clean and deliberate through the comb, workers filling cells at the pace of a colony that had found its footing. She'd sourced 2 additional colonies from a farmer 12 miles east, a man named Del Pruitt, who kept bees the old-fashioned slovenly way, and hadn't noticed he had a swarm cluster in a hollow fence post until Lydia pointed it out. And she'd relocated them to 2 of the cleaned hive bodies and was nursing them up. 5 colonies now, working. But 5 colonies in spring couldn't fix a failing orchard by August. Not alone. "How much production?" she asked. "He didn't give me a number. He said—" Rowan stopped. Something crossed his face that she read as humiliation, which he was managing by reducing it to logistics. He said he needed to see the land producing enough to cover the note, and then some, or he'd have to make other arrangements. Other arrangements meaning sell. Yes. She looked at the orchard. She looked at the 5 hive bodies she could see from where she stood, all of them with entrance activity now, workers going in and out in the quick focused lines of foraging bees doing what they were born to do. The apple trees were blooming now, more than they had when she arrived. She could see it, the difference, the slightly thicker scatter of white flowers on the branches closest to the apiary. It wasn't dramatic, but it was there. "The bloom is better this year than last?" she asked. He looked up. "Yes, it's—" He looked at the trees more carefully. She watched him see what she'd been tracking for 2 weeks. "It's better. Because the bees are working again. The pollination rate is going up." She crossed her arms. "The trees need the full season. That's what I told you at the beginning." "I know. I can't change the biology of it." "I know that too." He wasn't defensive. He was just heavy with it, the weight of a timeline that didn't care what was reasonable. "I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you because you should know." She appreciated that, at least, that he'd told her rather than carried it alone and let it poison the air between them. "Is there anything that produces faster?" she said, thinking out loud. "Not the orchard. What else is on the land?" He looked at her. "The honey." "Yes." He shook his head slowly. "The colonies are barely— they're stronger than you think." She'd been in all 5 hives that week. The Pruitt swarms were building fast. New bees were emerging, foragers multiplying. The hum of the apiary had a different quality now, a fullness rather than a thread. Not enough to harvest a big yield, not this year, but enough to sell what we have. Raw honey, local. There's a market for that. People in Millhaven pay for it at the market. "It won't be enough." "No," she agreed. "Not alone. But it's something, and something buys time." She looked at him squarely. "Do you have anything else? Anything the land's been producing without you noticing?" He was quiet for a moment, then reluctantly, the reluctance of a man who didn't like having missed something, he said, "The black locusts. The ones along the apiary clearing. They're blooming. Locust honey." She felt something shift in her chest. Not excitement exactly, but the particular attention of someone who has just heard the right answer. Locust honey was pale, late to granulate, mild and clean-flavored. Apiarists who knew what they had could command real prices for it. "How many trees?" 20, maybe more along the creek. "And the bees have been working them?" "I've been seeing them on the bloom since last week." She turned back toward the apiary without another word. She needed to pull the supers, check what was there, what was capped, what was close. It wouldn't be a full harvest, nothing like her parents' operation had managed in a good year. But locust honey from a live apiary, sold early at the Millhaven Saturday market. That was money. Real money, if she priced it right. She heard him come to stand behind her, that careful distance he kept, like he was aware of taking up space and had decided to be deliberate about it. "How do you know all this?" he said. Not skeptically. More like he was trying to place her. Not in the category of woman at a wedding, but in whatever category actually fit. "My parents kept 50 colonies at our peak," she said. "I started working the hives when I was 8. My mother kept a notebook for every colony. I had my own by the time I was 12. She paused. "It's the one thing I know how to do better than anything else." "You shouldn't have been working a milliner's shop," he said. It came out blunt, without softening, and she thought for a moment he hadn't meant to say it out loud. She didn't answer right away. She crouched in front of the nearest hive body and watched the entrance. Bees coming in heavy with pollen. Orange, from what she thought she knew, the wild mustard in the field at the property's south end. "You work with what's in front of you," she said finally. "I needed to eat. The milliner's shop was there." "And Silas Boone," he said. There was something careful in his voice that wasn't judgment, more like he was walking on uncertain ground and knew it. "And Silas Boone," she agreed. She kept her eyes on the hive. "I'm not going to pretend I was only after the farm. I wasn't. She stopped, started over. "I thought he was more than he turned out to be. That's on me." "It's not. Some of it is." She stood up. "I wanted to believe a person who was telling me what I needed to hear. That's not entirely his fault." She looked at Rowan. "I'm not defending him. He left me in front of 40 people with a note. There's no excuse for that. But I also chose not to see the things that were already there to see." Rowan was looking at her with that same expression she'd seen at the wagon on Clement Street. Not pity, not even sympathy exactly, just attention, the kind you gave to things that were worth paying attention to. "You're harder on yourself than you need to be," he said. "Probably," she said, "but it's a useful habit. Keeps me from making the same mistake twice." She went back to the shed, back to her father's notebook, and she spent the rest of the afternoon in the particular focused quiet of a person doing the math on a problem that doesn't have an easy solution, but might have a workable one. She pulled the first honey harvest on a Thursday, 3 days after the conversation with Rowan about the bank. It was not a large harvest. She'd warned him. 2 full supers from the survivor colony, both capped, heavy with the pale gold of locust honey. The Pruitt colonies weren't ready yet. They were still building, still packing the brood nest before they'd have excess to spare. But she judged the survivor colonies strong enough, the stores thick enough that taking the top supers wouldn't compromise the hive. She worked in the early morning when the bees were slower, using the smoker to ease them back from the frames and pulling each one with the deliberate care of someone who knew what she was asking of the hive. Rowan watched from outside the clearing. She'd given him a veil and told him to stay back unless she called for him, and he'd done it, which she appreciated because a lot of men couldn't hold themselves back from getting in the middle of something they didn't understand. By mid-morning, she had 22 pounds of capped comb in the storage room off the equipment shed, and she spent the afternoon rendering it through the old extractor she'd found under a canvas tarp in the corner. The mechanism was stiff and one of the barrel clamps was cracked, but it turned, and what came out of it was clean and pale and smelled faintly of locust flowers. She poured the first jar and held it up to the light from the window. The color was the clear gold of early morning, not the dark amber of wildflower honey, but something paler, more delicate, almost translucent. Through the glass you could see the light pass straight through it. She'd made honey before, hundreds of times. But she hadn't done it in 3 years, not since the farm, and the smell of it and the weight of the jar in her hand did something to her chest that she hadn't been prepared for. She stood at the work table in the shed and held the jar and was very still for a moment. Then she set it down and labeled it. Practical work. No time for standing around getting sentimental over honey. She set up at the Millhaven Saturday market 2 weeks later. Rowan had offered to come. She'd told him she was fine alone. He'd looked at her for a moment like he was going to argue, and then he didn't, which was the right decision, though she thought it might have cost him something. She loaded the wagon herself. 28 jars by then, the Pruitt colonies having cooperated with a second small pull, and drove into town in the early morning when the air was still cold enough to show her breath. She set up between a woman selling dried herbs and a man with crates of early radishes and turnips, and she arranged the jars on the cloth-covered table in a neat row, and she waited. The first person who stopped was a child, maybe 6 years old, who had gotten ahead of the woman who was presumably his mother and was staring at the honey jars with the pure, uncomplicated desire that only small children could still show for things. "Is that honey?" he said. "It is," Lydia said. "What kind?" "Black locust. It's different from regular honey. You want to try a little?" She offered the tip of a small wooden spoon with a drop of it, and the boy tasted it with the serious attention of a critic, and then his face did the thing that good honey-made faces do, and he turned around and shouted, "Mama!" at a volume that was completely disproportionate to the information he was conveying. She sold 11 jars in the first hour. The second hour brought the more complicated customers. Several women who recognized her from the wedding, from the church steps, from the weeks of town gossip that had followed. She watched them clock her, watched the moment of recognition cross their faces, and she kept her expression neutral and her voice pleasant, and she let the honey speak for itself. If someone wanted to buy it from the disgraced bride who was now living on Rowan Calloway's land, that was their business. The honey was still good. One of those women was a Mrs. Eleanor Pruitt. No relation to the farmer Del Pruitt, just a coincidence of similar names, who ran the dry goods side of a family general store that sold food products. She picked up a jar and turned it in her hands the way Lydia had the first morning in the shed. "Locust," she said. She looked up. "Where's your apiary?" "Calloway land east of town," Lydia said. "The black locusts along the apiary clearing are mature. The bees have had full access." "How many jars a month?" Lydia kept her face still. This was what she'd hoped for but hadn't expected this fast. "Depends on the season. This month, 30. End of summer." She thought about the 5 colonies, the growth rate, the locust stand, and what it could support. Could be 60, maybe more. Eleanor Pruitt looked at the jar a moment longer. Then she set it down and picked up another one and held it to the sky, same as Lydia had, the pale gold light through the glass. "I'll take what you have today," she said, "and I want a standing order, monthly." She named a price that was fair, just barely fair, the price of a woman who was not going to leave easy money on the table. "If you want to negotiate, I'm open." "I want to negotiate," Lydia said immediately. She named a number 12 cents higher per jar. Eleanor Pruitt made a face, and they landed in the middle and shook hands over the table, and Eleanor Pruitt carried 14 jars of locust honey to her wagon, and Lydia stood at her market table with $17 in her apron pocket, and felt, for the first time since May, like the ground under her feet was solid. She was packing up the remaining jars at the end of the morning when she heard her name. Not said to her, said behind her back, in the carrying whisper of a woman who had misjudged acoustics. "Living out there alone with him. I don't care what she says about the work." Well, what choice did she have? Nobody else offered her anything. That's charitable. I think she knew what she was doing. A woman in her position. Lydia finished packing the jars. She did it with care, patting each one in the cloth she'd brought. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge it. She lifted the crate and carried it to the wagon, and she drove back east out of Millhaven with $17 in her pocket and the locust honey smell still faint on her hands. And she did not let them have the satisfaction of seeing her jaw tight. But it was tight. She was honest with herself about that. On the empty road with just the horses' footfalls and the spring wind in the grass on either side. It was tight because there was no version of her life in which people didn't look at a woman who had been publicly abandoned and find a way to make it her fault. She had known that walking out of the church. She had known it accepting Rowan's offer on Clement Street. She had known it, and she had done it anyway because the alternative, the boarding house, the milliner's shop, the slow diminishment of a person who had bigger things in her, was worse than the whispers. She wasn't going to stop. That was the thing about herself she was most certain of, sitting on that wagon in the spring wind. She was not going to stop. She turned up the lane to the Calloway property, and the gray horse found his own way home without much guidance from her, which was the kind of loyalty she could appreciate in an animal. The apiary clearing was visible from the lane in the afternoon light, the 8 hive bodies in their row, The black locust trees behind them bright with white clusters of bloom, and above all of it, the small, constant movement of bees. Hundreds of them, more than last week, more than the week before, going out and coming back the way they always did. Steady and purposeful, and not caring at all about what the people in town were saying. Rowan was at the equipment shed when she pulled up. He looked at her face when she climbed down from the wagon, and something in his expression did the thing it sometimes did. That quick, careful read like he was taking a measurement he wouldn't mention out loud. "How'd it go?" he said. She reached into her apron pocket and held up the folded bills. "Standing order with Eleanor Pruitt's store," she said. "Monthly, and the honey's moving." He looked at the money and then at her, and she thought she saw, briefly, something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite surprise, but was somewhere between the two. The face of a man who had hoped but not let himself count on it. "That's good," he said, simply, without decoration. "It's a start," she said. She put the money back in her pocket. "I need to check the Pruitt hives before dark. The second one was building fast last week. I want to see if they're starting to backfill the brood nest. That's how you know they're ready to expand." She walked past him toward the apiary. She'd gone 3 steps when he said, "Lydia." She turned. He was still standing by the shed door, one hand resting on the frame. He looked for a moment like he was going to say something he'd been carrying a while. The jaw-working thing, the hat-turning, except he wasn't wearing his hat. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." She looked at him, thought about the borrowed dress and the cold boarding house room and the note she still had in her trunk somewhere, folded into the inside pocket of her winter coat. Thought about the $17 in her apron and the pale gold honey and the way the survivor colony was filling the 4th frame now, building and building, making something out of nothing the way they always had. "I had nowhere else to go," she said. Then, more honestly, "And this is the work I know how to do." He nodded. Small, once. Like that was enough. She turned back toward the apiary. The afternoon light was long and gold across the clearing, the kind of light that made even neglected things look like they were on the way to something better, and the bees moved through it without stopping, intent on the only thing they'd ever known how to do. She went to check the hives. Summer came to the Callaway land the way it always did in that part of Colorado. Not gradually, not with the polite transition that late spring suggested was coming, but all at once, like someone had turned a dial. One week the mornings were still cold enough to see breath, and then they weren't. And the grass in the south field went from green to gold faster than seemed fair, and the light changed from the thin silver of spring to something heavier and more direct that pressed down on the shoulders during the middle hours of the day. Lydia barely noticed. She was too busy. By the end of June, she had 8 functioning colonies. The Pruitt swarms had built out fully. She'd added second brood boxes to both of them in late May, and they'd taken to the space immediately, the way a crowded family takes to a bigger house, with the particular energy of something that had been constrained and was now free to expand. She'd sourced 2 more colonies from a woman named Ada Fitch, who kept bees on the far side of the county and had more than she needed. Ada was 73 years old and had been keeping bees for 50 of those years, and had the particular manner of very old beekeepers, which was a kind of patient amusement at everyone who thought there was a faster way. "You're the Mercer girl," Ada had said, the first time Lydia appeared at her door. She said it the way people said things they already knew, testing whether the other person would flinch. "Lydia Mercer," Lydia said. "Yes." "Left at the church." Ada looked at her over the rims of glasses that had been repaired with a piece of wire at the left hinge. "You don't look ruined." "I'm not," Lydia said. Ada had laughed. A short, dry sound like bark splitting. "Come look at the hives then. I've got 2 that need a better situation than I can give them." That had been a useful relationship, the kind that came without performance or social negotiation. Ada said what she thought and expected the same in return, and on her 3rd visit she'd pressed into Lydia's hands a small, water-stained booklet of her own hive notes going back 30 years and said, "Your mother kept bees," which was not a question. "She did," Lydia said. "Good keepers or just keepers?" "Good," Lydia said without hesitation. Ada nodded. Like that explained Lydia adequately. "Take the booklet. Give it back when you've read it twice." The orchard was changing. It was changing slowly, the way everything that mattered changed. not in the dramatic overnight way of stories, but in the accumulation of small facts that you didn't notice until you held them up against where you'd started. Rowan had said almost nothing about it for weeks, and then one morning in late June, he came to find her at the apiary clearing with a look on his face that was trying not to be what it was. "Come look at something," he said. He took her to the eastern section of the orchard, which was the block farthest from the apiary. The last section she'd have expected to show change, since the bees worked outward from their hives, and the eastern trees were at the limit of their reasonable foraging range. He stopped in front of a mid-sized apple tree, one she'd walked past a dozen times without stopping, and pointed up. She looked fruit. Small, hard, barely the size of a large marble, the pale green of things that had just decided to exist. But there, dozens of them, where the blossoms had set instead of dropping. She counted without meaning to, stopped when she reached 40 because the number started to feel significant. "That tree hasn't set fruit in 4 years, Rowan said. He said it flatly, but she heard what was underneath it. 4 years was the length of his father's illness and death and the slow unraveling of the land after. 4 years was a specific grief wearing the clothes of an agricultural fact. She didn't say anything for a moment. The small apples were the exact color of new growth, and they moved slightly in the morning air. "It's not the whole orchard," she said. "No." He looked along the row. "But it's not nothing." "It's not nothing," she agreed. He turned away before she could read his face fully, but she caught the edge of it. A man trying to stay even, and almost managing it. She looked back at the tree, and she thought about her mother, who had always said that the bees didn't care about your timeline. They worked according to something older and more patient than any individual's need. She was beginning to believe that the orchard operated the same way. The first real trouble of the summer arrived on a Tuesday in July, in the form of a man named Gerald Mace. Mace was a land agent, a careful description for a man whose actual function was to identify properties in financial difficulty and facilitate their transfer to buyers who had capital and no particular attachment to the land itself. He was 45 years old, lean in an office way rather than a work way, with the clean-cut appearance of someone who had decided his presentation was a professional tool. He arrived at the Calloway property in a good buggy and knocked on the main house door at 10 in the morning, which was when Rowan was in the orchard and Lydia was at the equipment shed checking the extractor mechanism. She heard the knock and came around the side of the house without thinking, still wearing her work apron and carrying a wrench she'd been using to tighten a loose bolt on the extractor drum. Mace looked at her. His eyes did the quick inventory men like him did, cataloging, assessing, placing her in whatever category his experience suggested. She watched him land on hired help and stay there. "I'm looking for Rowan Calloway," he said. "He's in the orchard," she said. "What's your business?" He smiled the way a man smiled when a woman asked a question he didn't feel obligated to answer. "I'll wait," he said. She went and found Rowan herself, coming back through the trees to the house with a look on her face that she kept carefully neutral so he could read the information in it rather than her reaction to it. "Man named Mace, land agent. He's at the door." Rowan's jaw tightened. That movement she knew now. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked toward the house without speaking. Lydia followed because it was her business too, even if Mace didn't think so. She stood slightly back during the conversation on the porch, but she listened. Mace had been sent, he said, by a consortium of investors, he didn't name them, who were aware that the Calloway property carried a banknote due in August, and who were prepared to make a fair offer for the land and structures, which would allow Rowan to settle the note and come away with something rather than nothing. "Something rather than nothing," Rowan repeated. "Foreclosure is difficult for everyone," Mace said. "Our offer would prevent that. Your offer would also give you the land." "That's the nature of a sale, yes." Rowan was quiet for a moment. Lydia could see the side of his face from where she stood, the controlled stillness of a man holding something in because he'd decided that losing his temper in front of this person would cost him more than it was worth. "I'm not selling," Rowan said. Mace looked past him, at the house, at the orchard visible beyond the equipment shed, at the evident state of a property that had been struggling and was only now beginning to come back. His expression was the politely skeptical face of a man who had heard, "I'm not selling" before, and knew what it usually meant was not yet, but eventually. The offer stands through August, Mace said pleasantly. He held out a card. If your circumstances change. Rowan took the card. He looked at it once. Good day, he said. After Mace's buggy had disappeared back down the lane, Rowan stood on the porch and held the card and didn't speak. Lydia waited. He's been circling this property for 2 years, Rowan said finally, since the banknote became public record. He looked at the card again, and then he put it in his shirt pocket, which she thought was interesting. Not thrown away, kept. The move of a man who wanted to know his enemy's contact information. His consortium is what Henderson at the bank is waiting on. If I miss the August payment, they have a buyer ready. Then we don't miss the August payment, Lydia said. He looked at her sideways. You say that like it's simple. I know it's not simple. I'm saying it like it's decided. She pulled off her work gloves and folded them, thinking. How far short are we? He told her the number. She ran the math against what she knew. The honey revenue from Eleanor Pruitt's standing order. The 2 additional market days she'd managed since the first one. A small order she'd taken last week from a restaurant in the next town that had heard about the locust honey through Clara Witt, who had turned out to be useful in exactly the way she'd offered. The gap was still significant. Not impossible, but it required the orchard to produce something that could be sold, and it required the apple crop to come in faster than apple crops generally cooperated with. The early variety, she said. The ones in the East Block, the ones that set... When do they come in? Late August, he said. If they come in at all. They're coming in, she said. I've been watching them. They're small right now, but they're there. If we can get them to market... Late August is the last week of August, he said. The note is due August 20th. She was quiet for a moment. Then we need something else, she said. The something else came from Clara Witt, which Lydia would not have predicted, but in retrospect should have. Clara had, in the week since the market conversation, moved from observer to, not ally exactly, more like a woman who had decided Lydia Mercer was more interesting than the gossip about her and wanted to be on the right side of that when it became relevant. She arrived at the property on a Wednesday afternoon in late July with a proposal. The Millhaven Harvest Fair, she said, sitting in Rowan's kitchen with a cup of coffee she'd made herself from supplies she'd brought, which Lydia found so entirely Clara that she couldn't argue with it. It's the 3rd week of August, 8 days before your note is due. I know when the fair is, Rowan said. There's a produce competition, Clara said. First place in honey carries a $20 prize. First place in preserved goods is $15. But that's not why I'm here. She set down her coffee and looked at Lydia. The fair has a vendor market, 3 days. More than 800 people come through from 4 counties. I know of 6 merchants from Glenwood and 2 from up the pass who come every year specifically to source local products for the following season. Lydia looked at Clara. You're saying the fair is a sales opportunity. I'm saying the fair is the largest sales opportunity in this county, and you have a product that nobody else in this region is selling. Clara folded her hands on the table. Locust honey is not common. Ada Fitch keeps some, but she doesn't market it. You have 8 colonies working a mature locust stand. If you price correctly and present correctly, you could move more product in 3 days than in 3 months of Saturday markets. Rowan said, Clara, Rowan, I am not doing this out of charity, Clara said, with a sharpness that was clearly old and comfortable, the sharpness of people who'd known each other long enough to skip the social cushioning. I'm doing this because I'm a business-minded woman, and I can see what's happening on your land, and I would like Millhaven to have this particular business in it, rather than whatever Gerald Mace's consortium would put here. She picked up her coffee again. That's my full, honest reason. He looked at her. Then he looked at Lydia. Lydia said, How much can you move in 3 days? And she was talking to herself as much as either of them, doing the math out loud. 8 colonies. We can pull the supers on the locust hives this week. They're ready. I checked 2 days ago. The wildflower supers on the Pruitt colonies are probably another week out, but we could pull them early if we needed to. Total yield, she ran the number. Maybe 90 jars. 100 if we're lucky. At what price? Clara asked. Eleanor Pruitt pays 60 cents a jar. I've been selling at market for 70. At the fair, Clara said, you sell at 85. The buyers from Glenwood will pay $1 if you have enough to make it worth their while to place a standing order. She paused. I know them. I can introduce you. Lydia looked at the numbers in her head. The honey revenue, the potential fair sales, the early apple crop that was still 2 weeks out. She looked at the gap between what they had and what the bank required. It was still there, but it was smaller now, smaller in a way that felt like a problem with a solution rather than a situation without one. "I'll also enter the honey competition," she said. Clara smiled. Not the social smile Lydia had seen on the church steps, but a real one, quick and slightly sharp. "Yes, you will." The 2 weeks before the fair were the hardest weeks of work she'd done since arriving on the property, and the work she'd done since arriving had not been easy. She pulled the honey harvest across 4 days, working from dawn until the light failed, and Rowan worked alongside her without being asked. He couldn't inspect hives, couldn't read the frames the way she could, but he could carry. He could filter through cheesecloth with steady hands. He could manage the extractor once she'd shown him how to load the frames without destroying the comb. They worked in near silence most of the time, which had become their natural mode. Not uncomfortable silence, but the silence of people who were comfortable enough not to need noise. One evening, in the second week, she was labeling jars by lamplight at the work table in the shed when he came in from the equipment side with 2 cups of coffee and set one next to her without ceremony. She'd been bent over the labels for 3 hours, and her back hurt, and she was calculating whether she'd have enough beeswax candles to supplement the honey display at the fair. And the math was not cooperating. "You ever miss it?" he said. He was leaning against the opposite workbench, both hands wrapped around his cup. She looked up. "Miss what?" "Before." He shrugged slightly. "When this wasn't your problem." She thought about the boarding house room and the milliner's shop and the specific quality of a life that was surviving rather than living. Then she thought about the church steps and Cora Hensley's ivory dress and the note with its careful handwriting. "No," she said. She said it plainly, without drama, because it was simply true. "I miss my parents. I miss the farm the way it was before things went wrong." She picked up the next jar. "I don't miss what came after." He nodded, looking into his coffee. "My father bought this land when I was 11, he said. It came out quietly, like something that had been waiting for the right moment to be said. He had this idea about it, not just the orchard. He wanted it to be something that lasted, something that would still be here when he wasn't." His jaw did the thing. "He wasn't here long enough to see it fail." "It hasn't failed," Lydia said. "Not yet. Not yet," she agreed, because she wasn't going to soften it with false reassurance. He didn't need that from her. "But we're still here." He looked at her across the work table. The lamp was between them, throwing warm, uneven light, and outside the summer night was making its sounds, crickets and the far-off call of something in the dark trees. "You're still here," he said. There was something in how he said it that was careful in a different way than usual. A weight to it. Like he was noting something that surprised him, even now. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to the labels because there were still 23 jars to go and the fair was in 9 days, and she was not going to let the moment become something that complicated the work. But she was aware as she wrote that something in the room had shifted slightly. The way the air shifts before rain, not the rain itself, just the pressure change that tells you what's coming. She kept writing. The fair opened on a Thursday. The Millhaven Harvest Fair was held at the county ground on the east side of town, and by the time Lydia arrived at 7 in the morning with the wagon loaded and Rowan driving, the field was already half full of vendors setting up in the pale early light. She found her assigned space. Clara had managed the vendor registration, and she and Rowan unloaded in efficient silence, the way they moved around each other now, aware of where the other person was without having to announce it. She had 94 jars. She'd stayed up until midnight the night before finishing the labels, which were simple, just the name she'd decided on in the 3rd week of working the hives, written in her own clear hand. Callaway Apiary, Black Locust Honey, Single Origin. Below that, the property location. Nothing fancy. Her mother had taught her that good honey didn't need decoration. The display table was cloth-covered in dark linen Clara had lent her, and she arranged the jars in 3 tiers using wooden risers Rowan had built from scrap lumber without being asked. The pale gold of the honey caught the morning light as the sun came up over the fair ground, and she stood back and looked at it and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing done correctly. "It looks good," Rowan said. He was standing beside her, hands in his pockets. He'd worn his better shirt, she noticed. Not dressed up, but the shirt without the worn elbows. She didn't comment on it. "Yes," she said. "Now we see if good is enough." By 10 in the morning, she'd sold 31 jars. By noon, she'd sold 58, including 2 cases, 12 jars each, to a man from Glenwood named Harlan Dodd, who handled specialty food products for 3 restaurants and a hotel, and who had, through Clara's introduction, tasted the honey from a small wooden spoon she offered, and stood very still for a moment with the expression of a man making a financial calculation. "How much can you supply monthly?" he said. She named a number. He countered. They met in the middle and shook hands, and she wrote the order on the back of one of her labels because she hadn't brought a proper order book, which was a mistake she wouldn't make twice, and Harlan Dodd walked away with 2 cases and a standing arrangement for the following 6 months. She stared at the written order for a moment. Then she looked up and found Rowan 6 feet away talking to a man about the orchard. She'd been sending anyone with orchard questions to him because it was his land to speak to, and she caught his eye briefly and gave him the smallest nod, the kind that meant something happened without specifying what. And he read it the way he read most things. She communicated without words, which was correctly. He turned back to his conversation, but she saw the shift in his shoulders, the small release of something held too tight. The honey competition was judged at 3 in the afternoon by a panel of 3. A professional confectioner from the county seat, a woman who had won the competition 4 of the last 6 years, and was presumably judging her own potential dethroning with complex feelings, and a retired farmer named Bill Tarr, who everyone agreed had no financial stake in anything and therefore the most honest palate. Lydia submitted her entry, 1 jar, labeled, sealed, and then went back to her table and kept selling because standing around waiting for a result was not how she was built. She was explaining to a woman the difference between locust honey and clover honey when Clara appeared at her elbow, and Clara's face was doing something that Clara's face very rarely did, which was showing excitement before it had been processed into something more controlled. "First place?" Clara said quietly. Lydia looked at her. "By unanimous decision," Clara said. Bill Tarr apparently told the confectioner it was the cleanest honey he'd tasted in 20 years, and the confectioner agreed, which is notable because he disagrees with everyone about everything as a professional habit. Lydia was quiet for a moment. The woman she'd been talking to was looking between them with polite curiosity. "Excuse me," Lydia said to her. "I'll be right back." She stepped aside with Clara. "The prize money," she said. $20, Clara said. "Combined with the Dodd order and what you've sold today." She looked at the table where 9 jars remained. "What's the running total?" Lydia had been keeping it in her head. She said the number. Clara's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That puts you at 83% of the note," Lydia said, not counting the late apple crop. She looked at the remaining jars. "And we have 2 more fair days." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "You knew it might work," she said, "when I came to the property." "I thought it might," Lydia said. "I didn't know." "Is there a difference?" "There's always a difference," Lydia said. "Knowing means you can guarantee it. Thinking means you're willing to try anyway." She went back to the table and sold the remaining 9 jars in the next 40 minutes, and then she took orders for more. She'd brought a proper piece of paper this time, borrowed from the confectioner's assistant. And by the time the afternoon light started to drop toward evening, she had a list of names and quantities and delivery dates that she folded carefully and put in her apron pocket next to the prize ribbon, which was blue and slightly wider than her hand. Rowan found her at the wagon when she was loading the empty crates. He looked at the table, bare now, every jar gone, and something in his face did the full release of whatever he'd been holding all summer. Not happy, exactly. More like a man who has been bracing for impact and finally been told he could stop. "Tell me," he said. She told him the total. All of it. The Dodd order, the prize money, the standing orders, the remaining jar sales. She told him where that put them against the banknote. He stood by the wagon and listened and didn't interrupt. And when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "There's still a gap," she said. "The apple crop has to come in, and it has to come in before the 20th. I know. I'm not saying it's done. I know that too." He looked at her. The evening light was the long gold kind that didn't last. But it's different than it was. She thought about August 20th. She thought about the late apple trees in the eastern block, the small, hard fruit she'd been watching all summer, willing them toward ripeness on no particular authority. She thought about Gerald Mace's card in Rowan's shirt pocket, and the consortium waiting, and the bank. Yes, she said, it's different than it was. She climbed up onto the wagon seat with her empty crates and the blue ribbon in her pocket and the list of orders folded against her chest, and the town of Millhaven spread out in the last of the evening light behind her. And somewhere in the eastern block of the Callaway orchard, in the dark between the trees, small hard apples were doing the slow patient work of becoming what they were always going to be. The apples came in on August 14th. Not all of them. The main crop, the larger varieties in the western and central blocks, were still 3 weeks out at minimum, and Lydia had told Rowan not to count on those for the bank. But the early variety in the eastern block, the small greenish-gold apples she'd been watching since June, had been doing their slow arithmetic all summer, and they came in on a Tuesday morning with the particular decisiveness of fruit that had made up its mind. Rowan found her already in the trees when he came out at sunrise, moving between the rows with a practiced hand, testing weight and color and the give of skin under her thumb. She wasn't a trained orchardist, but she'd grown up watching her father test fruit by feel, the way a good apple resisted pressure without being hard, the way color moved from the stem end outward when the sugar was developing correctly, and her hands remembered things her mind sometimes forgot. "They're ready," she said, when she heard him coming through the grass. He stopped beside her and looked up at the nearest tree. The fruit hung in small clusters, pale gold with a faint blush on the sunny side, and there were more of them than he'd let himself count in July. She watched him count them now, watched his jaw work. "How long do we have?" he said. "A week before they start going soft. Less if the temperature climbs." She looked at the sky. It was clear, the particular flat blue of high summer with no weather in it. "We need to pick and get them to market by the weekend." "That's 4 days." "Yes." He pulled a hand through his hair. "It's 200 trees in that block. We can't pick 200 trees in 4 days with 2 people." "No," she said. "We can't." She'd been thinking about this since the first week of August, when she'd looked at the apple cluster density and done the math and understood what would be required. "Clara Witt's nephew is between jobs. I asked her yesterday if he was available and she said yes. And the Pruitt boy, Dell's son, the older one, he was asking me last week if we had work coming." Rowan looked at her. "You arranged this already." "I thought it was likely to be necessary," she said. "I didn't want to say it out loud until I knew the fruit was ready." She met his eyes. "I should have told you I was thinking ahead. I'm sorry for that." He was quiet for a moment. "Don't apologize for thinking," he said. "I should have been thinking the same thing." He looked back at the trees. "All right, how do we do this?" She told him. They picked for 4 days straight. Clara's nephew was a young man named Thomas, who was 19 years old and built like a fence post and had the useful quality of following instruction without needing it repeated. Del Pruitt's son, whose name was actually Clement, but who went by Clem, was 22 and had grown up doing farm work and understood the logic of an orchard in a way Thomas didn't, so Lydia put Clem in charge of the picking sequence, working systematically through the rows so nothing got missed and nothing got double-handled, and put Thomas on the wagon runs into Millhaven. She and Rowan picked alongside them. These were the days that would stay with her longest, she thought, even later when other days had crowded in. The 4 days of the apple harvest in the eastern block with the summer thinning toward its end, the air beginning to carry that faint edge it got in Colorado in mid-August, when the night started to remember that autumn was a real thing. The work was straightforward and physical and required her full attention. You couldn't pick fruit carelessly, couldn't grip too hard or drop from too high or let the stems break at the wrong angle. And there was a rhythm to it that shut out everything else. She and Rowan worked the same row most of the second day, and she was aware of him in the way she'd become aware of him over the summer. Not intrusively, just the background knowledge of where another person was, how they moved, the specific sounds of their work. He picked methodically, careful with the fruit in a way she hadn't expected from a man who wasn't a trained orchardist. She'd mentioned it. "My father made me practice with eggs first," he said, without looking up from the branch he was working. "Before he'd let me near the trees, said if I could pick a full basket of eggs without cracking one, I understood the concept." She looked at him. "How old were you?" 12. Did you crack any? 3. The corner of his mouth moved. Threw one at my brother, which my father didn't count against me on grounds that it was intentional and therefore a different category of mistake. She laughed. Not the polite, contained kind, but the real kind, short and sudden, the kind that surprised her. He looked at her sideways when she did it, and his expression did the thing she'd learned over the summer, the small shift that meant something had landed for him. I didn't know you had a brother, she said. 2. Both of them in Wyoming now. The older one writes sometimes. He moved to the next branch. It's not bad between us, just distant. Do they know about the banknote? She asked. She said it carefully, aware it was personal, ready to pull back if he indicated it was too far. He didn't pull back. They know the land's been struggling. I didn't tell them how close it was. He paused. Thomas would have told me to sell. Sell and come to Wyoming and start over. He means it well. But this is my father's land, he said, simply, without drama. And I am not going to hand it to Gerald Mace's consortium. She turned back to her branch. The apples were cool and smooth under her hands, carrying the morning temperature even in the afternoon. Then we get it done, she said. By Friday evening, they had the full Eastern Bloc harvested and sorted. 3 grades, as Lydia had organized it. The best fruit for the fresh market, the second grade for the general store accounts, the third for whatever processing orders they could find. Thomas had made 6 wagon runs into town. Eleanor Pruitt had taken the first 2 loads without negotiation, which meant she'd been expecting them. The restaurant in the next town, the same one that had ordered honey, had taken a case of the grade 1 fruit on Thomas's 3rd run, on the word of Lydia's written recommendation alone. On Friday night, Lydia sat at the work table in the shed with the order book, a real one now, purchased at the Millhaven General Store in July. And she added the apple revenue to the honey revenue to the fair sales to the Dodd standing order to the prize money. And she looked at the number. And she looked at the banknote figure she'd written in the back of the book the day Rowan told her what they needed. The number on the left was larger than the number on the right. She put the pencil down. She looked at the numbers for a long moment, the way you looked at something you'd been working toward for so long that seeing it arrive felt slightly unreal. Her handwriting was neat, and the figures were correct. She checked them twice because she was constitutionally unable not to. And the gap was there, clear and factual. They had enough. Not a great deal more than enough, but enough. She closed the book and went outside into the warm August night, and she stood in the yard between the cottage and the equipment shed, and she tilted her head back and looked at the sky, which was doing nothing dramatic. Just stars, the ordinary summer quantity of them, blurring slightly at the edges where the Milky Way went soft. She thought about her mother, thought about her specifically, not the general abstracted grief of loss, but the specific person, the way she'd stood in the apiary in the early morning with her veil up and her hands bare, reading a frame without gloves because she said gloves made her clumsy and the bees could tell the difference. She would have had an opinion about all of this. She would have had opinions about Silas Boone and Rowan Calloway and the Millhaven Harvest Fair and locust honey pricing, and probably also about the state of the cottage's stove tile before Lydia fixed it. She had opinions about everything. Meredith Mercer, delivered in the particular tone of someone who was sharing facts rather than judgments, which made them impossible to argue with. You work with what's in front of you, Lydia had told Rowan back in the spring, her mother's words offered as her own. She went back inside and slept better than she had in months. The morning of August 20th, Rowan drove into Millhaven to the bank. Lydia had offered to come. He'd looked at her offer for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not reluctance, not refusal, something more like wanting to do this particular thing with his own hands. I'll tell you when I'm back, he said. She watched the wagon go down the lane, and she turned back to the apiary, and she checked all 8 hives, methodically, the way she did every other morning, because the banknote being due didn't suspend the bees' needs, and the bees had no idea any of it was happening. He was back by noon. She heard the wagon on the lane from the apiary, and she finished the frame she was examining. Good brood pattern. The queen was moving well. This colony had become her strongest since the Fitch split in July. And she replaced the lid and walked back toward the yard. He was standing by the wagon when she came through the orchard. He'd taken his hat off, and he was holding it, and his face was doing something she hadn't seen before, something open in a way he usually wasn't, like a door standing wide. She stopped in front of him. "Done?" she said. "Paid in full," he said. "Henderson's face, when I put it on the counter—" He stopped. His voice had an edge to it that wasn't grief, wasn't quite relief. More like a man setting something down that he'd been carrying for a very long time. He had to check it twice. "Good," she said. He said Mace's consortium had been asking after the property as recently as last week. He looked at her. He said it like he expected me to be surprised. "Were you?" "No." He turned the cat in his hands once, that habit, the final processing turn. "No, I wasn't." She nodded. There was something in the air between them that was different from the lamplit work table moment in July, different from all the various moments of the summer. Heavier, cleaner, like the air after a long rain finally stopped. She was aware of it, and she suspected he was too, and she was also aware that she didn't know exactly what to do with it yet. So she did what she'd been doing all summer when things were unclear. She let it sit and went back to the work. "The Pruitt colonies are going to need their second super by the end of the week," she said. "And I want to do a mite count on the survivor colony. She's my strongest queen, but I haven't checked the mite load since June." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not disappointment, not exactly. More like a man who understood timing and was willing to wait for the right season. "All right," he said. He put his hat back on. "I'll start on the new fencing in the south field this afternoon." She went back toward the apiary. She'd gone 10 steps when he said her name. She turned. He was still standing by the wagon, one hand resting on the sideboard. He looked for a moment, like the question was going to be something large. Then something in him settled, and the question he asked instead was small. "Did you eat anything this morning?" She thought about it. Coffee before sunrise, nothing after. "No," she admitted. "There's bread in the kitchen," he said. "I stopped at the bakery on the way back." She almost said she was fine. She almost said she'd get something later. Instead, she stood in the yard in the August noon heat and felt, suddenly and inconveniently, the full weight of the past 4 months. The picking and the market days and the lamplit label nights and the smoker and the extractor and the bank numbers and the church steps and the note with its careful handwriting, all of it pressing down at once in the way exhaustion did when you finally allowed yourself to stop. "All right," she said. "Thank you." They sat in the kitchen with bread and the end of the morning's coffee, and neither of them talked much, and it was the most comfortable she'd felt in a kitchen since her mother's, which she didn't say aloud but thought was probably legible on her face. The Harvest Festival was announced at the end of August. The county's annual late harvest celebration was bigger than the Millhaven Fair, a 3-day event held at the county ground that drew people from across the region, vendors and buyers and families, and the various social machinery of a community that had been working hard all summer and was ready to gather and acknowledge it. Clara had been on the organizing committee for 11 years and had secured Lydia a prime vendor space, a corner position with good foot traffic. "You've earned a reputation," Clara said matter-of-factly, when she delivered the news. 3 months ago, you were the woman who got left at the church. Now you're the woman with the locust honey that Harlan Dodd can't stop talking about. She said it without sentimentality, just noting the shift. "People want to meet you." Lydia looked at her. "People wanted to talk about me in May, too." "Different kind of talking," Clara said. "The first kind you had no power over. The second kind you built. There was truth in that." Lydia turned it over after Clara left, sitting on the cottage step in the late August evening with the sound of the apiary behind her. That constant, low, living hum that she had come to find more grounding than almost anything she knew. She had built something. It wasn't what she'd imagined building. A year ago, when Silas Boone had looked at her across a table and asked a question that turned out to mean something different than she'd thought. But it was real, and it was hers, and it was still standing. She was thinking about the festival display. How many jars, which grades, whether to bring a sample jar for tasting, when the sound of hooves on the lane pulled her attention. Odd for this hour. Rowan was inside, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She stood up. The rider who came up the lane was unfamiliar for a moment, in the low light. A man on a good horse, not a working horse, but a horse that had been well kept and recently groomed. He pulled up at the edge of the yard, and she looked at his face, and the bottom dropped out of something in her chest. Silas Boone had gotten thinner in the way men got thin when things hadn't gone the way they expected. His face was the same The good teeth, the dark eyes, but something in it had changed in the months since May, some quality of easy confidence that had either worn off or been worn down. His clothes were still good, but not as new as they'd have been in spring. He sat on his horse and he looked at her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. "Lydia," he said. She stood in the yard in her work clothes with her hands that smelled of beeswax and propolis, and she looked at the man who had left her at an altar with a note, and she waited to feel something large. Anger, maybe, or the old hurt, fresh again. She catalogued what was actually there and found it was smaller than she expected, simpler, the particular tired clarity that came from having spent 6 months doing something real. "Silas," she said. He dismounted. She noticed he didn't tie the horse, kept a hand on the rein like he wasn't sure how long this would take. That told her something. "I heard what you've done out here," he said. His voice was careful, feeling for solid ground. "The honey, the orchard. Everyone's talking about it." "I know," she said. He looked at the apiary clearing, visible from where they stood. The 8 hive bodies in the long evening light, the black locusts beyond, the apple trees of the eastern block showing their second flush of growth against the late sky. He looked at it the way Gerald Mace had looked at the land in spring, but differently, not calculating worth in dollars, calculating worth in a more personal currency. "The Hartley situation," he said, and stopped. She waited. It fell apart. The family pulled the business arrangement in June, and he stopped again. His jaw moved. He was doing the thing men did when they wanted to tell a story in which they weren't the primary cause of their own difficulty. "It was complicated." "I'm sure it was," she said. Neutral. Not kind, not cruel. He looked at her directly then, abandoning whatever indirect approach he'd ridden 3 miles to try. "I made a mistake, Lydia." "Yes," she said. "You did. I came to—" He seemed to realize, looking at her face, that he'd prepared for a different version of this conversation. A version where she was still the woman on the church steps, still raw and displaced and without ground to stand on. He looked at her and she could see him adjust, slightly, like a man who had rehearsed a speech for an audience that had moved. "I thought maybe we could talk. About what happened. About whether there was anything—" "No," she said. Simple, clean, not angry. He blinked. "Lydia?" "Silas." She put her hands in her apron pockets. The apron pocket where, 6 months ago, she'd carried $17 from the first honey market and felt the ground solidify under her feet. "I don't have any anger left for you. I used it up in June, I think, somewhere around the 3rd week of harvesting the locust supers." She looked at him evenly. "But there's nothing to talk about. You chose what you chose. I built what I built. Those are 2 separate facts." He looked at the land again, at the hive bodies and the trees and the equipment shed with its lamp burning, at the cottage behind the main house where her life was happening, small and imperfect and entirely her own. "You're happy here," he said. He said it like it surprised him, like the possibility hadn't been in his calculation. She thought about this question honestly, the way she thought about most things now. Happy was a complicated word, and she distrusted simple applications of it. She was tired, often. The work was hard, and the cottage was small, and the stove tiles she'd fixed was starting to separate at the top edge again and would need to be patched before winter. She had stood in this same yard last week and been so frustrated with a stuck extractor bolt that she'd said words her mother would have had opinions about. But she was here. She was doing the work she knew how to do, and that was, she found, standing in the evening light looking at the man who had handed her a note through a 10-year-old boy. That was more than enough. "Yes," she said, "I am." He stood for another moment. The horse shifted its weight. Somewhere in the apiary clearing, the bees were making their end-of-day sound, the settling hum of a colony coming home for the night. Silas Boone put his foot in the stirrup and mounted his horse. He looked down at her from there, and something passed across his face that she might have called regret if she'd been inclined to read it generously. "Take care of yourself, Lydia," he said. "I always have," she said. She watched him ride back down the lane until the trees swallowed him, and she stood in the yard afterward for a moment, just breathing, just listening to the bees. Then she turned around and went inside to wash her hands before supper. Rowan saw Silas Boone ride away from the window of the main house kitchen. He hadn't meant to watch. He'd been at the table with a cold cup of coffee and the ledger he'd been updating since getting back from the bank. And he'd looked up at the sound of hooves and seen the man on the good horse pull up in the yard, and something in him went very still in the way it did when he was deciding whether to act or hold. He held. He watched Lydia through the glass, her posture mostly, since he couldn't hear the conversation. He watched her stand in the yard with her hands in her apron pockets, and he watched her face do almost nothing, which he'd learned over the summer meant she was doing a great deal. He watched Silas Boone look at the land the way a man looked at things he'd underestimated too late. He watched Lydia say something short and then something else, and he watched Silas mount his horse and leave. He looked back down at his ledger. When she came inside, she washed her hands at the basin and dried them on the kitchen towel and didn't immediately say anything. He didn't ask. He'd learned, gradually, across months of proximity, that she told things when she was ready to tell them and not before, and that asking ahead of that was a specific kind of intrusion she didn't appreciate. She sat down across from him and picked up the coffee pot and looked into it. Empty. She set it back down. "He came back," she said. Flat statement of fact. "I saw." She looked at her own hands on the table. "He wanted to. I think he'd practiced something on the way over. I didn't let him get to it." Rowan said nothing. He was aware of what his face was doing and was keeping it still. "It was smaller than I expected," she said. "Seeing him." She was quiet for a moment, working something out. "I thought I'd feel more. In May, I think I would have. But," she looked up, "it's hard to feel devastated about a door that closed when you're standing in a house you built on the other side of it." He looked at her across the kitchen table. The lamp was between them again, that same geometry as the July work table, and the same quality of something that needed to be said settling into the air between them. He'd been carrying something since the fair, since before the fair, if he was honest, which he tried to be. He'd been carrying it with the specific patience of a man who understood that timing mattered, and that the wrong moment for a true thing could make the true thing go wrong. But she'd just told him, in her way, that the door was closed, and he was out of patience for waiting on the right season. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. He had her full attention, which was not a small thing. Lydia's full attention had a weight to it. "I didn't stop at the church because I recognized you," he said. "I stopped because you were the only person on those steps who wasn't performing something." He paused. "Everyone else was doing grief or curiosity or sympathy. You were just there. Standing in that dress with your jaw set like you were daring the morning to come at you again." She was very still. "I offered you work because the work was real, and I needed someone," he continued. "That part was true. But I also—" He stopped, started over. "I wanted to give you somewhere to go. That's the full honest truth of it. And I should have said that a long time ago instead of pretending it was purely a business arrangement." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the August night was doing its late summer things. Crickets, a light wind off the hills, the distant sound of the creek that ran along the property's south edge. "Rowan," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. You don't owe me anything for staying. The work you've done here is, you've given this land back its life. That stands regardless of anything else." He looked at her squarely, because he'd decided if he was going to say this, he was going to say it without looking away. "But I think about you more than I should, if we're just employer and beekeeper, and I'd rather say that plainly than pretend I don't." The silence lasted long enough that he started to wonder if he'd miscalculated badly. Then she said, "That night in the shed, when you brought coffee?" "Yes," he said. "I knew then," she said. She said it simply, with the characteristic Lydia absence of drama. "I went back to the labels because I wasn't ready. Not because I didn't—" She stopped. He watched her choose words with the care she gave to things that mattered. "I've had one experience of a man who told me what I needed to hear and meant something different. I needed to know the difference." "And?" he said. She looked at him. "You left a mattress from the spare room because you thought about whether I'd be comfortable, and you didn't mention it, and you didn't ask for credit for it." She let that sit. "That's a different kind of man." He held her gaze, and he felt something in his chest do what chests did when they'd been tight for a long time and finally weren't. "I'm not easy," he said. Because it was true, and she deserved to know it. I go quiet when things go wrong, and I take too long to ask for help, and I'm not good at—" He made a gesture that meant any of this. What we're doing right now, talking about it. Any of this. "I patch stove tiles by myself at 6 in the morning," she said. "I'm not looking for easy." He almost smiled. "The real one, the left side one." "No," he said. "I didn't think you were." She looked at him for a long moment. This woman who had stood at an altar in a borrowed dress with 40 people watching and had not broken, who had pulled honey from a struggling apiary and sold it until the land was solvent again, who had looked at Silas Boone in the yard an hour ago and felt nothing much at all. "Then let's not complicate it more than it is," she said. "We're two people who work well together and trust each other. That's a better start than most people get." "Yes," he said. "It is." She stood up and picked up the empty coffee pot and went to fill it from the water pail, and he watched her do it with the particular quality of attention he'd been trying to conceal for 4 months, and didn't conceal anymore. The Harvest Festival opened on the 1st of September. It was a clear, high-sky morning, the air carrying the first real suggestion of autumn. Not cold, just different, like the season was clearing its throat. Lydia drove the wagon in with 90 jars of honey, 8 varieties of comb sample, and a clean lettered sign that read Cowboy Apiary in letters she'd painted herself on a piece of oak board Rowan had cut and sanded for her without being asked. He rode alongside on the gray horse, which had strong opinions about the festival traffic, and expressed them at length for the first quarter mile before settling into resigned cooperation. The vendor space was the corner position Clara had secured. Good light, high foot traffic, visible from the main entrance. Lydia set up methodically, the way she did everything. The honey jars on their tiered risers, the oak sign at the back, a small arrangement of late locust blossoms she'd cut that morning because she thought it would read well, and also because they smelled like the apiary, and she found that grounding in crowds. Rowan set up the wagon as a secondary display. The apple crates, the first-grade fruit arranged at the front where people could see the color. He was less practiced at this than she was, and he knew it, and he positioned himself to take direction without making it visible, which she appreciated. By mid-morning, the festival was full. More people than the Millhaven Fair, the foot traffic denser, the noise a steady, layered sound of voices and music from somewhere near the main tent, and the occasional bellow of livestock from the competition pens in the north field. Lydia worked the table without stopping, explaining the locust honey to people who'd never heard of it, offering tastes on small wooden spoons, taking standing orders from 2 merchants she hadn't met before who had heard about Harlan Dodd's arrangement and wanted equivalent terms. She was in the middle of a conversation with a woman from up the pass about winter honey storage when she heard a shift in the crowd. Not loud, just a change in texture, the specific quality of people noticing something. She looked up. Silas Boone was walking through the festival ground. She saw him before he saw her. He was with a group. Men she didn't recognize, the financial-looking type, the men who traveled in small groups and surveyed things with the eyes of people assessing value. He was performing ease, the old Silas performance she recognized now with the clarity of distance, the hand in the pocket, the casual scan, the look of a man who belonged everywhere. He saw her table. She watched him see it, watched the slight stall in his stride, the recalibration. Then he looked at the sign, Callaway Apiary. Then he looked at her. He started walking toward her. The woman from up the pass was still talking. Lydia answered her question about cold temperature crystallization with full attention, gave her 2 jars and a standing order form. And by the time she looked up again, Silas was 10 feet away, and the men he'd been with had drifted toward the main tent. The crowd around her table had thinned for a moment, the way crowds did. A random pause, a gap in the traffic. It gave him space to come forward, which was bad timing from Lydia's perspective, and probably intentional from his. "You were serious then," he said. He looked at the display, at the jars, at the sign. "About staying." "I was always serious," she said. "I heard you paid off the Callaway note." He said it without preamble, which was at least more honest than the Lane visit. "Word travels." "It does," she agreed. She had customers approaching. She could see them from her peripheral vision, a family, the children already pointing at the honey jars with the particular intensity of children who want to taste everything. "Lydia." He lowered his voice. Something in his face was working at sincerity, and she thought it might even be genuine, which was almost worse. "What I did in May was, Silas, She kept her voice even. There are customers waiting. And what you did in May was exactly what you did. You made the choice that made the most sense to you, and it didn't work out the way you planned, and now you're here. But I'm not the correction for that. She met his eyes directly. We're done. Not bitterly, just done. He opened his mouth. She said what she said, Rowan's voice. He had come up beside her, close enough that his arm was a few inches from hers, and he said it without heat, without aggression, in the tone of a man stating a fact that he was content to state only once. Silas looked at him. He was taller than Rowan, but Rowan had the quality of a man who knew where his feet were, who didn't take up more space than he meant to and didn't take up less. And that quality was hard to argue with without looking like you were arguing with furniture. Calloway? Silas said. Boone, Rowan said. Just the name. Just the acknowledgement that they were both in the same physical space. The silence between the three of them lasted about 4 seconds. The family with the children arrived at the table in a rush of small voices, and Lydia turned to them with genuine warmth. Genuine because children at a honey table were one of the uncomplicated things in a world of complicated ones, and she handed the nearest child a tasting spoon and didn't look back. When she glanced up a minute later, Silas was gone. Rowan had moved to the apple display and was answering a question from a man about the Eastern Bloc variety. She caught his eye briefly. He gave her the small nod. The one that meant all right? She gave it back. Yes. They turned back to their respective customers. Clara Witt appeared at the table in the early afternoon with the expression of a woman who had witnessed the morning scene from somewhere in the crowd and was exercising considerable restraint in not commenting on it. The confectioner from the county seat wants to talk to you, she said. He's been asking around the whole morning, something about a wholesale arrangement. Lydia looked at her. You're not going to say anything about what happened earlier? I'm going to say, Clara said carefully, that Silas Boone rode away from this festival looking like a man who finally understood the full cost of what he'd thrown away. She paused. And then I'm going to take you to meet the confectioner. The confectioner was a compact, white-haired man named Edmund Starr, who had run a specialty food business in the county seat for 22 years and had the unnerving habit of tasting things with his eyes closed. He tasted the locust honey with his eyes closed for a full 10 seconds. What's your annual yield? He said, opening them. She told him. He made a face that was the confectioner's version of polite but pointed disagreement. Can you scale? She thought about the property, the black locust stand, the potential for additional trees along the creek corridor, the 8 colonies, the expansion capacity if she split the strongest ones in spring, the additional hive bodies she could build over winter. In 2 years, yes, she said. Not faster than that. He looked at her steadily. I need a supplier who gives me honest timelines more than I need one who promises what they can't deliver. He named a price per pound that was the best she'd been offered by a significant margin. 2 years, at the yield you can manage. We'll formalize when you're ready to expand. She looked at him, thought about her mother's notebook, Ada Fitch's water-stained booklet, her father's cramped handwriting, the survivor colony that had been there when she arrived. Barely alive, still doing the only thing it knew how to do. 2 years, she said, and they shook hands. The festival wound down in the long amber light of the September afternoon, and by the time the vendors were packing up, the noise had softened to something easier, the crowd thinning out to the people who had nowhere particular to be and were in no rush to get there. Lydia had sold 81 jars, taken 4 new standing orders, given her card to 7 people she hadn't known that morning, and had the signed letter of intent from Edmund Starr folded in her apron pocket next to the order book. She was packing the empty crates when Ada Fitch appeared. Lydia hadn't known she was there, hadn't seen her in the crowd. But Ada materialized at the edge of the table the way very old people sometimes did, as if they'd simply decided to be somewhere and bypassed the usual process of arrival. She was wearing her better dress, which was still a fairly modest dress, and her glasses with the wire hinge, and she looked at the empty table and the sign with a small private expression. Sold out, Lydia said. I can see that. Ada picked up one of the locust blossom stems that had been in the display arrangement. It had dried slightly over the course of the day, the white flowers papery now. Your mother would have done the same, she said. Not a compliment exactly, just a placement. This is where you fit in the line of things. You knew her? Lydia said. She hadn't known this. Knew of her, Ada said. She was from 2 counties east. She had a reputation with bees even when she was young. She set the stem down. Good reputation, the useful kind. She looked at Lydia over her glasses. You've got it too now, in case you were wondering whether anyone was noticing. She turned and walked back into the thinning crowd before Lydia could answer, which was entirely characteristic. Lydia stood at the empty table and held that for a moment. The way certain things landed differently when you weren't expecting them. Rowan loaded the last of the apple crates and came to stand beside her. He looked at the table. Bare, the sign still up, the small dried locust stems. He looked at her face, reading whatever was on it with the accuracy he'd developed over a summer of paying attention. Good day, he said. Very good day, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The letter. From Star. 2-year arrangement, she said. Best price I've been offered. He nodded. She watched something in him settle, the same slow release as the bank morning. A man adjusting to a version of things that was better than what he'd been braced for. My father planted the locust trees the same year he put in the first hives, he said. He said it slowly, like he was working out the meaning as he spoke. He always said the trees and the bees needed each other. I thought he meant practically the bloom, the honey. But I think he meant... He stopped. I think he meant that neither one of them was the point by itself. She looked at him. He was watching the last of the festival light on the empty table, on the dried blossoms, on the sign with its clean-painted letters. No, she agreed. Neither one of them is. They drove back east together in the early evening, the wagon loaded with empty crates and a few remaining jars, in the particular quiet of 2 people who have finished a hard season and are still standing. The road back to the property ran along the ridge before it dipped toward the lane, and from the ridge in clear weather you could see the full layout of the Calloway land. The main house, the equipment shed, the cottage behind it, and the apiary clearing with the black locusts dark against the sky, and beyond that the rows of apple trees moving in the light end-of-day wind. Lydia looked at it from the ridge. She looked at it the way she hadn't let herself look at it when she first arrived, when she'd been too busy surviving the present to think about whether she belonged to any particular future. The orchard was not what it had been. Not yet. There were still trees that hadn't bloomed this year, still sections of the property that bore the marks of the years it had been left to manage itself. The cottage still had a draft at the east window she hadn't gotten to. The barn needed new boards on the south face before winter. There was always something. That was the nature of land, of anything that was worth tending. It never arrived at finished. It just kept becoming. But the bees were there. 8 colonies, all of them strong now, going into fall, building up their winter stores with the focused urgency of creatures that understood seasons in the most fundamental way. The locust honey was in people's kitchens across 4 counties. The eastern apples were in crates in Eleanor Pruitt's store and Harlan Dodd's restaurant, and 2 towns she hadn't been to yet. The banknote was paid, and Gerald Mace's consortium was looking for a different opportunity. She thought about the woman at the boarding house, the one who had lain on a narrow bed on the first morning of May and done her accounting of what she had and what she needed, and found the gap between those 2 things required everything she knew how to do. She thought about the note in her coat pocket, still there in the lining of the winter coat at the back of the cottage trunk, still in its cream-colored envelope. She'd thought about throwing it away several times. She kept not throwing it away, and she'd finally understood why. Not because it held anything worth keeping, but because the things that hurt you into motion were worth remembering. You didn't have to be grateful for them. You just had to be honest that they happened. The gray horse found the lane turnoff without guidance and started down it, the familiar slope, the familiar ruts. Rowan was beside her on the wagon seat, close in the way that had become ordinary over the months. The proximity of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms and stopped needing to mark the distance. I want to put in 10 more hive bodies before spring, she said. I know, he said. I've been looking at lumber. She looked at him. When? 2 weeks ago. He kept his eyes on the lane. I thought it was likely to be necessary. She felt the corner of her mouth move. He was using her words back at her without making a point of it, which was exactly the way he did things. The cottage east window needs rechinking, she said, before the cold comes. I'll do it Saturday, he said. I can do it myself. I know you can, he said. I'll do it anyway. She let that sit. The wagon came around the last curve of the lane, and the property opened up before them. The house with its repaired porch, the equipment shed with its lamp already lit inside from the last time she'd been in there, the apiary clearing visible past the far corner, the black locust trees making their shapes against the early evening sky. She thought about her mother standing in an apiary at sunrise with her veil up and her hands bare, reading a frame by feel and smell, and the sound the colony made when it was content. She thought about her father's cramped handwriting, every observation over 20 years, the careful record of something he'd loved enough to document. She thought about Ada Fitch saying your mother would have done the same with the particular matter-of-factness of someone paying the highest compliment they knew how to pay. She thought about the survivor colony, still in the West End hive, still the strongest queen she had, still doing the work she'd been doing before Lydia arrived and would be doing after the season turned. Bees didn't know about banknotes or harvest festivals or men who left notes through 10-year-old boys. They knew about the hive. They knew about the work. They knew about what needed building and what needed protecting and the difference between those two things. Rowan pulled the wagon to a stop by the equipment shed and climbed down. He came around to her side, which he didn't usually do, and held his hand up. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I meant what I said in the kitchen," he said. Quiet, direct, the way he said things he'd decided were worth saying. "And I'm not going to pretend I didn't." She put her hand in his and climbed down from the wagon. She let him keep it for a moment longer than the step required. "Neither am I," she said. They stood in the yard in the early September evening with the last of the light going gold across the apiary clearing, and the bees made their end-of-day sound, that low, steady, living hum, the sound of 10,000 small lives doing exactly what they were made to do, in the place they'd decided to be, building something that would outlast the season. Neither of them said anything else. There wasn't anything that needed saying. Some things built slowly, the way orchards built, the way colonies built. Not in moments of declaration, but in the accumulation of days, of labor, of choosing to stay when staying was hard, of coffee left on the heat and mattresses moved from spare rooms and stove tiles patched in the early morning, and hands that smelled of beeswax and propolis and work. The Mercer girl from the boarding house room, the woman in the borrowed dress on the church steps, the beekeeper with the pale locust honey and the survivor colony and the note in her coat pocket. She had been all of those women, every version of them, and she stood in the yard of the Callaway land in the evening light, and she was not finished yet. She was not finished by a long way. That was the thing about losing the wrong future. You only noticed it was the wrong one after you'd stopped mourning it long enough to look up and see where you'd actually arrived. She looked at the apiary clearing, at the hive bodies in their row, at the apple trees of the eastern block, their second season fruit already showing the color that meant next year would be fuller, would be better, would be something her father's notebook would have had words for. The season would turn, the bees would winter, the trees would go bare and come back in spring with more blossoms than the year before, because the bees would be there, and the bees would be there because she was there. And she was there because a man had asked a simple question on a street corner on the worst morning of her life, and meant it plainly, without an angle. She squeezed Rowan's hand once. Then she let go and went to check the hives before dark. Some things you did not stop doing because the day had been significant. The work was the work, and it needed doing, and she knew how. That had always been enough. That had always been, when she thought about it honestly, everything.